and already crumbling through the powdery air. Gives out a ghastly creak and comes to rest. And immediately the ash-minus grey men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operations from your sight. But above the grail, and in the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T. Eckleberg. The eyes of Dr. T. J. Eckleberg are blue and gigantic minus. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead, from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. And then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or forgot them, and moved away. Brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let barges through, the passengers on waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There is always a halt there of at least a minute, and it was because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular restaurants with her and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about, chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her minus, but I did. I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, and when we stopped by the ash heaps he jumped to his feet, and taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he tanked up a good deal at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violets. The supercilious assumption was that on Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low white minus, washed railroad fence, and we walked back 100 yards along the road under Dr. Eckleberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small block of yellow bricks sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it, and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-minus night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes. The third was a garage minus repairs, GUILSON. Cars bought and sold minus, that I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust minus covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office. Wiping his hands on a piece of waste, he was a blonde, spirituous man, anemic, and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a dump gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson," "Old man," said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," answered Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. I've got my man working on it now." "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else. After all." "I don't mean that," explained Wilson quickly. "I just meant minus. His voice faded off and Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and in a moment, the thick-ish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in the middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her surplus flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crepe minus shine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly and, walking through her husband, as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. Then she wet her lips and, without turning around, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. "Get some chairs. Why don't you? So somebody can sit down." "Oh, sure," agreed Wills unhurriedly and went toward the little office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. Who moved close to Tom. "I want to see you," said Tom intently. "Get on the next train." "All right. I'll meet you by the News Minus stand on the lower level." She nodded and moved away from him just as George Wilson emerged with 2 chairs from his office door. And a grey, scrawny Italian child was setting torpedoes in a row along the railroad track. "Terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckleburg. "Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object?" "Wilson? He thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. So Tom Buchanan and his girl and I went up together to New York minus, or not quite together. For Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibilities of those East Eggers who might be on the train. She had changed her dress to a brown figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her to the platform in New York. At the News Minus, and she bought a copy of Town Dazzle and a moving Minus picture magazine, and in the station drugstore, some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. Upstairs, in the solemn echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before she selected a new one. Lavender Minus colored with grey upholstery, and in this we slid out from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately she turned sharply from the window and, leaning forward, tapped on the front glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said earnestly. I want to get one for the apartment. They're nice to have minus a dog. Rockefeller, in a basket, swung from his neck, cowered a dozen very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. What kind are they? Asked Mrs. Wilson eagerly as he came to the taxi minus window. All kinds. What kind do you want, lady? I'd like to get one of those police dogs. I don't suppose you got that kind. The man peered doubtfully into the basket, plunged, in his hand drew one up. Wriggling by the back of the neck. That's no police dog, said Tom. No, it's not exactly a Paul ICE dog, said the man with disappointment in his voice. It's more of an Airedale. He passed his hand over the brown wash minus rag of a back. Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching cold. I think it's cute, said Mrs. Wilson enthusiastically. That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale minus, undoubtedly. There was an Airedale concerned in it somewhere, though. Its feet were startlingly white minus, changed hands and settled down into Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weather minus proof coat with rapture. Is it a boy or a girl? She asked delicately. That dog? That dog's a boy. It's a bitch, said Tom decisively. Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it. On the summer Sunday afternoon that I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn the corner. Hold on, I said. I have to leave you here. No, you don't, interposed Tom quickly. Myrtle LL be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment. Won't you, Myrtle? Come on, she urged. I'll telephone my sister Catherine. She's said to be very beautiful by people who were to know. Well, I'd like to. But minus we went on, cutting back again over the park toward the West Hundreds. At 158th Street, the cab stopped at one slice in a long white jacket of apartment houses, throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood. Mrs. Wilson gathered up her dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. I'm going to have the McKees come up, she announced as we rose in the elevator. And of course I got to call up my sister too. The apartment was on the top floor minus, a small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors with a set of tape-stride furniture, entirely too large for it, so that to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. Looked at from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet and the countenance of a stout old lady down into the room. Several old copies of Town that lay on the table together with a copy of Simon Called Peter in some of the small scandal magazines of Broadway. Mrs. Wilson was first concerned with the dog. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added on his own initiative a tin of large hard dog biscuits minus, one of which decomposed apathetically in the saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. I have been drunk just twice in my life. The second time, sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson called up several people on the telephone. Then there were no cigarettes, and I went out to buy some at the drugstore on the corner. When I came back, they had disappeared, so I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter minus. Minus either it was terrible stuff, or the whiskey distorted things because it didn't make any sense to me. Just as Tom and Myrtle minus. After the first drink, Mrs. Wilson and I called each other by our first names minus reappeared. Company commenced to arrive at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30, with a solid sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. Her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. When she moved about, there was an incessant clicking as innumerable pottery bracelets jingled up and down upon her arms. She came in with such a proprietary haste and looked around so possessively at the furniture that I wondered if she lived here. But when I asked her, she laughed immoderately, repeated my question aloud, and told me she lived with a girlfriend at a hotel. Mr. McGee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a white spot of lather on his cheekbone, and he was most respectful in his greeting to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome and horrible. She told me with pride that her husband had photographed her 120 - 7 times since they had been married. Which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently affected moment by moment, and as she expanded, the room grew smaller around her until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy, creaking pivot through the smoky air. "My dear," she told her sister in a high mincing shout, Most of these fellas will cheat you every time. All they think of is money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet, and when she gave me the bill you'd have thought she had my appendicitis out. What was the name of the woman? Asked Mrs. Mickey. Mrs. Eberhard. She goes around looking at people's feet in their own homes. I like your dress, remarked Mrs. Mickey. I think it's adorable. Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment by raising her eyebrow in disdain. It's just a crazy old thing, she said. I just slip it on sometimes when I don't care what I look like. But it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean. Pursued Mrs. We all looked in silence at Mrs. Wilson, who removed a strand of hair from over her eyes and looked back at us with a brilliant smile. Mr. Mickey regarded her intently with his head on one side, and then moved his hand back and forth slowly in front of his face. I should change the light, he said after a moment. I'd like to bring out some modeling of the features. Cried Mrs. Mickey. I think it's minus, minus, minus. Her husband said SH. You Mickeys have something to drink, he said. Get some more ice and mineral water. Myrtle, before everybody goes to sleep, I told that boy about the ice. Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. These people, you have to keep after them all the time. She looked at me and laughed pointlessly. Then she flounced over to the dog, kissed it with ecstasy, and swept into the kitchen, implying that a dozen chefs awaited her orders there. I've done some nice things out on Long Island, asserted Mr. Mickey. Tom looked at him blankly. 2 of them we have framed downstairs. To what? Demanded Tom. To studies. One of them I call Montauk point minus minus the girls, and the other I call Monta point minus minus the sea. The sister Catherine sat down beside me on the couch. Do you live down on Long Island too? She inquired. Do you know him? I live next door to him. That's where all his money comes from. Really? She nodded. I'm scared of him. I'd hate to have him get anything on me. This absorbing information about my neighbor was interrupted by Mrs. Mickey's pointing suddenly at Catherine Chester. I think you could do something with HER. She broke out, but Mr. McKee only nodded in a bored way and turned his attention to Tom. I'd like to do more work on Long Island, if I could get the entry, said Tom, breaking into a short shout of laughter as Mrs. Wilson entered with a tray. She'll give you a letter of introduction. Won't you, Myrtle? So he can do some studies of him. His lips moved silently for a moment as he invented. Catherine leaned close to me and whispered in my ear, "Neither of them can stand the person they're married to. Can't they? Can Tess, T.A. and them?" She looked at Myrtle and then at Tom. What I say is, why go on living with them if they can't stand them? If I was them, I'd get a divorce and get married to each other right away. Doesn't she like Wilson either? The answer to this was unexpected. It came from Myrtle, who had overheard the question, and it was violent and obscene. "You see," cried Catherine triumphantly. She lowered her voice again. Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the lie. "When they do get married," continued Catherine, "they're going west to live for a while till it blows over. It'd be more discreet to go to Europe." "Oh, do you like Europe?" she exclaimed surprisingly. "I just got back from Monte Carlo." Just last year. I went over there with another girl." "Stay long?" "No, we just went to Monte Carlo and back. We went by way of Marsalis. We had over $1,200 when we started, but we got gypped out of it, all in 2 days in the private rooms. We had an awful time getting back, I can tell you. God. How I hated that town. The late afternoon sky bloomed in the window for a moment, like the blue honey of the Mediterranean minus. Then the shrill voice of Mrs. McKee called me back into the room. I almost made a mistake. Too, she declared vigorously. I almost married a little KYK who'd been after me for years. I knew he was below me. Everybody kept saying to me, "Lucia, that man's way below you." But if I hadn't met Chester... "Yes, but listen," said Myrtle Wilson, nodding her head up and down. "At least you didn't marry him." "I know I didn't." "Well, I married him," said Myrtle. "And that's the difference between your case and mine." "Why did you, Myrtle?" demanded Catherine. Nobody forced you to. Myrtle considered. I married him because I thought he was a gentleman, she said finally. I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. You were crazy about him for a while, said Catherine. Crazy about him, cried Myrtle incredulously. Who said I was crazy about him? I never was any more crazy about him than I was about that man there. I tried to show by my expression that I had played no part in her past. The only CRAZ why I was when I married him. I knew right away I made a mistake. And the man came after it one day, when he was out. She looked around to see who was listening. Oh, is that your suit? I said. This is the first I ever heard about it. But I gave it to him, and then I lay down and cried to beat the bed all afternoon. She really ought to get away from him, resumed Catherine to me. They've been living over the garage for 11 years. Excepting Catherine, who felt just as good on nothing at all. Tom rang for the janitor and sent him for some celebrated sandwiches, which were a complete supper in themselves. I wanted to get out and walk the park through the soft twilight, but each time I tried to go, I became entangled in some wild, strident argument which pulled me back. Yet high over the city, our line of yellow windows must have contributed their share of human secrecy to the casual watcher in the darkening streets. And I was him too, looking up and wondering. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. Myrtle pulled her chair close to mine, and suddenly her warm breath poured over me, the story of her first meeting with Tom. It was on the two little seats facing each other that are always the last ones left on the train. I was going up to New York to see my sister and spend the night. He had on a dress suit and patent leather shoes, and I couldn't keep my eyes off him. But every time he looked at me, I had to pretend to be looking at the advertisement over his head. When we came into the station, he was next to me, and his white shirt minus front pressed against my arm minus. So I told him I'd have to call a policeman, but he knew I lied. I was so excited that when I got into a taxi with him, I didn't hardly know I wasn't getting into a subway train. All I kept thinking about, over and over, was, you can't live forever. You can't live forever. She turned to Mrs. McKee, and the room rang full of her artificial laughter. "My dear," she cried, "I'm going to give you this dress as soon as I'm through with it. I've got to get another one tomorrow. I'm going to make a list of all the things I've got to get. I'm a sergeant away and a collar for the dog and one of those cute little ash minus trays where you touch a spring, and a wreath with a black silk bough from Mother's grave that'll last all summer. I got to write down a list so I won't forget all the things I got to do." It was 9 o'clock, minus, almost immediately afterward. I looked and found it was 10. Mr. McGee was asleep on a chair, with his fists clenched in his lap, like a photograph of a man of action. Taking out my handkerchief, I wiped from his cheek the remains of the spot of dried lather that had worried me all the afternoon. The little dog was sitting on the table looking with blind eyes through the smoke and from time to time groaning faintly. People disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, and then lost each other, searched for each other, found each other a few feet away. Sometime toward midnight, Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face, discussing in impassioned voices whether Mrs. Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name. "Daisy! Daisy!" shouted Mrs. Wilson. "I'll say it whenever I want to. Daisy? Die minus, making a short, deft movement. Tom Buchanan unbroke her nose with his open hand. Then there were bloody towels upon the bathroom floor, and women's voices scolded, and high over the confusion, a long broken wail of pain. Mr. McKee awoke from his doze and started in a daze toward the door. And the despairing figure on the couch, bleeding fluently and trying to spread a copy of Taunt, battle over the tapestry scenes of Versailles. Then Mr. McKee earned and continued on out the door. Taking my hat from the chandelier, I followed. "Come to lunch someday," he suggested, as we groaned down in the elevator. "Where? Anywhere. Keep your hands off the lever," snapped the elevator boy. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Mitty. "I didn't know I was touching it." Sitting on clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands. Beauty and the Beast. Loneliness. Old grocery horse. Broken Bridge. staring at the morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train. Chapter 3. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft or taking the sun on the hots and of his beach while his two motor minus boats slit the waters of the Sound, drawing aqua planes over cataracts of foam. On week minus ends, his Rolls minus Royce became an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while his station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. And on Monday's 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops, unscrubbing, minus brushes and hammers and garden minus shears, repairing the ravages of the night before. Every Friday 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from a fruiterer or in New York minus. Every Monday the same oranges and lemons left his back or in a pyramid of Paul Plesshavs. There was a machine in the kitchen which could extract the juice of 200 oranges in half an hour. If a little button was pressed 200 times by a butler's thumb, at least once a fortnight a corps of caterers came down with several hundred feet of canvas and enough colored lights to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's in Warmer's garden. On buffet tables, garnished with glistening whores minus d'oeuvre, spiced baked hams crowded against salads of harlequin designs and pastry pigs and turkeys bewitched to a dark gold. In the main hall, a bar with a real brass rail was set up. By 7 o'clock the orchestra has arrived minus, no thin 5 minus piece affair, but a whole pet FUL of oboes and trombones, and saxophones and violets and cornets, and piccolos and low and high drums. The last swimmers have come in from the beach now, and are dressing upstairs the cars from New York parked 5 deep in the drive. And already the halls and salons and veranda, and is our gaudy with primary colors and hair shorn, and strange new ways and shoals beyond the dreams of Castile. The bar is in full swing, and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside, until the air is alive with chatter and laughter, and casual innuendo and introductions forgotten on the spotted, enthusiastic meetings between women who never knew each other's names. Laughter is easier, minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, tipped out at a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly. Become for a shock joyous moment, the center of a group, and then excited with triumph glide on through the sea minus change of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. Suddenly, one of these gypsies in trembling opal seizes a cocktail out of the air. A momentary hush, the orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligingly for her, and there is a burst of chatter as the erroneous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun. I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited minus, they went there. They got into automobiles which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. Once there, they were introduced by somebody who knew Gatsby, and after that they conducted themselves according to the rules of behavior associated with amusement parks. Sometimes they came and went without having met Gatsby at all. Came for the party with a simplicity of heart that was its own ticket of admission. I had been actually invited. I, chauffeur in a uniform of robin's egg blue, crossed my lawn early that Saturday morning with a surprisingly formal note from his employer minus. The honor would be entirely Gatsby's. It said if I would attend his little party that night. He had seen me several times and intended to call on me long before, but a peculiar combination of circumstances had prevented it minus, signed J. Gatsby in a majestic hand. Dressed up in white flannels, I went over to his lawn a little after 7 and wandered around, rather ill at minus. He's amongst whirls and eddies of people I didn't know minus, though he reigned. There was a face I had noticed on the commuting train. I was immediately struck by the number of young Englishmen spotted about, all well dressed, all looking a little hungry, and all talking in low earnest voices to solid and prosperous Americans. I was sure that they were selling something, bonds or insurance or automobiles. They were, at least, agonizingly aware of the easy money in the vicinity and convinced that it was theirs for a few words in the right key. As soon as I arrived, I made an attempt to find my host, but the 2 or 3 people of whom I asked his whereabouts stared at me in such an amazed way and denied so vehemently any knowledge of his movements that I slunk off in the direction of the cocktail table minus. The only place in the garden where a single man could linger without looking purposeless and alone. I was on my way to get roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when Jordan Baker came out of the house and stood at the head of the marble steps, leaning a little backward and looking with contemptuous interest down into the garden. Welcome or not, I found it necessary to attach myself to someone before I should begin to address cordial remarks to the passers-by. "Hello," I roared, advancing toward her. My voice seemed unnaturally loud across the garden. "I thought you might be here. she responded absently as I came up. I remembered you lived next door to minus minus minus. She held my hand impersonally, as a promise that she'd take care of me in a minute, and gave ear to two girls in twin yellow dresses who stopped at the foot of the steps. "Hello," they cried together. "Sorry you didn't win." That was for the golf tournament. Said one of the girls in yellow. "But we met you here about a month ago. You've dyed your hair since then," remarked Jordan. And I started, but the girls had moved casually on, and her remark was addressed to the premature moon. Produced like the supper, no doubt, out of a caterer's basket. With Jordan's slender golden arm resting in mine, we descended the steps and sauntered about the garden. Each one introduced to us as Mr. Mumble. "Do you come to these parties often?" inquired Jordan of the girl beside her. "The last one was the one I met you at," answered the girl in an alert, confident voice. She turned to her companion. "Wasn't it for you, Lucille?" "It was for Lucille too." "I liked to come," Lucille said. "I never care what I do, so I always have a good time. When I was here last, I tore my gown on a chair, and he asked me my name and address minus inside of a week. I got a package from Crowy Rears with a new evening gown in it." "Did you keep it?" asked Jordan. "Sure I did. I was going to wear it tonight." It was gas blue with lavender beads. 260 minus $5. There's something funny about a fellow that'll do a thing like that, said the other girl eagerly. "Who doesn't?" I inquired. "Gatsby. Somebody told me minus the two girls and Jordan leaned together confidentially. Somebody told me they thought he killed a man once." "I don't think it's so much DHAT," argued Lucio skeptically. "It's more that he was a German spy during the war." One of the men nodded in confirmation. I heard that from a man who knew all about him. "Grew up with him in Germany," he assured us positively. "Oh, no," said the first girl. "It couldn't be that, because he was in the American Army during the war." As our credulity switched back to her, she leaned forward with enthusiasm. "You look at him sometimes when he thinks nobody's looking at him. I'll bet he killed a man. She narrowed her eyes and shivered. Lucio shivered. We all turned and looked around for Gatsby. It was testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired that there were whispers about him from those who found this world. The first supper minus, there would be another one. After midnight minus, was now being served. And Jordan invited me to join her own party, who were spread around a table on the other side of the garden. A persistent undergraduate given to violent innuendo, and obviously under the impression that sooner or later Jordan was going to yield him up her person to a greater or lesser degree. Instead of rambling, this party had preserved a dignified homogeneity and assumed to itself the function of representing the staid nobility of the countryside minus East Egg, condescending to West Egg, and carefully on guard against its spect Broxipis gaiety. "Let's get up," whispered Jordan, after a somehow wasteful and inappropriate half-hour. "This is much too polite for me." We got up, and she explained that we were going to find the host minus. I had never met him, she said, and it was making me uneasy. The undergraduate nodded it in a cynical, melancholy way. The bar, where we glanced first, was crowded, but Gatsby was not there. She couldn't find him from the top of the steps, and he wasn't on the veranda. On a chance, we tried an important minus-looking door and walked into a high Gothic library. A stout, middle minus aged man with enormous soul minus eyed spectacles was sitting somewhat drunk on the edge of a great table, staring with unsteady concentration at the shelves of books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. He waved his hand toward the book minus shelves. About that, I ascertained they're real. The books, he nodded. Absolutely real minus of pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages and minus here. Let me show you. Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with volume one of his stoddard lectures. "See," he cried triumphantly. "It's a bona fide piece of printed matter." It fooled me. This fella's a regular Belasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness. What realism. Knew when to stop to minus. Didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect?